Hello friends, my name is JJ, and thank you so much for spending this beautiful Saturday, June the 22nd, 2019 with me. So, one of the big myths of American politics is that because the US only has two competitive political parties, that means that American voters are somehow starved for choice. In reality, I would argue that American voters actually have more choices than many of the citizens of other advanced democracies, because not only do American voters elect their politicians, but they elect their candidates too. And in a few months, they will be electing someone to challenge Donald Trump in the big, exciting 2020 American presidential race. So at present, there are over 200 people running to be the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. Seriously, that's not even a joke. The Federal Election Commission has registered over 200 candidates. You can look them up. But of course, only about 20 or so are really being taken seriously by mainstream political observers. Only 20 were invited to participate in next week's big all-candidates debates, for instance. And of those 20, the press is currently devoting most of its attention to 4 candidates in particular: Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Pete Buttigieg. And of those, the man who has emerged as the 2020 frontrunner is Joe Biden. Joe Biden was, of course, vice president for 8 years under President Barack Obama. He left office in 2017 with a pretty high approval rating, much like Obama himself. Indeed, Obama's decision to make Biden his vice president back in 2008 was really a very big gift to him in retrospect. Before he became vice president, Biden had been a senator from Delaware for 36 years, but he wasn't exactly a huge national figure. He had run for president himself a couple of times and always did extremely poorly. So today, a lot of people view his newfound popularity as almost entirely a byproduct of his association with Obama, who is still very well regarded by a lot of Americans, particularly anti-Trump voters. Now, a lot of the words you hear associated with Biden right now are things like safe and moderate and electable. The idea is that Biden is not a very remarkable or interesting candidate, but rather just someone who is kind of broadly well-known and competent and would probably make a decent enough president. However, this has also sired a lot of anti-Biden sentiment among voters further to the left. They say that Biden is an incredibly unambitious candidate for a progressive party to run in the year 2020, and that nominating him would be something on the spectrum between a wasted opportunity and a brazen act of self-sabotage. The assumption is that voters want Trump to be replaced by someone who is even more left-wing than Obama was, particularly on issues like healthcare and income inequality and climate change. Mr. 4-decade career politician over here doesn't really fit that bill. Because Biden is a fairly old man who has been involved in politics for so long, the left-wingers have had a lot of fun digging through his past and finding things that they can use to portray him as some out-of-touch dinosaur who is completely wrong for the 21st century. They've gone after him on racial issues and abortion and crime and feminism and all these other issues where the sort of progressive mainstream today is much farther to the left than Biden has been for most of his political career. But you know, a lot of this stuff is really more about questions of trust than anything else. If you believe that the sort of people who have been running the Democrat Party for the last couple of decades have all been these sort of crooked, wishy-washy, middle-of-the-road sellout types, then it's very easy to see a career politician like Biden as just being one more hack of this sort. However, if you see Biden as the heir to the much prouder tradition of relatively mild-mannered Democrats who have gone on to be elected president, then, well, there's a lot more to like. Most of the harshest left-wing critics of Biden are supporters of Bernie Sanders, a senator from Vermont. Sanders identifies as a democratic socialist.
I call myself a democratic socialist.
And has been one of the most solidly left-wing politicians in America for several decades now. He became particularly famous 4 years ago for his strong performance against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 Democratic presidential race, which a lot of people did not see coming. Now, why exactly Bernie Sanders did so well in the 2016 race is something that a lot of people have a lot of different theories on. A lot of Democrats interpreted it as a sign that Americans are a lot more hungry for further left politics than had previously been assumed. This is probably why so many of the 2020 Democrats are now running on platforms very similar to what Bernie Sanders ran on in 2016, supporting things like universal public health care, free college tuition, and higher taxes on the wealthy. But other people have argued that Sanders' success in 2016 was strictly fueled by the hatred that a lot of voters had for Hillary Clinton, meaning Sanders was merely in the right place at the right time. A guy in the Wall Street Journal crunched a bunch of the numbers a while ago and found that how left-wing you were was not actually a very good predictor of how likely you were to support Bernie over Hillary. There was also a famous phenomenon of people who voted for Sanders, and then when he lost, they turned around and voted for Donald Trump instead, who's obviously no great left-winger himself. So you can see it is kind of a complicated situation. And some of this might explain why Sanders is not exactly cruising to an easy victory right now. He does remain a broadly well-liked politician, however, and despite his advanced age, he is very popular with young people in particular, as anyone who has spent much time on Twitter will know. Moving on, we have Elizabeth Warren. She is a senator from Massachusetts, and in many ways quite similar to Sanders. Like him, she is considered one of America's more solidly left-wing politicians, but she also enjoys a unique reputation as sort of the thinking woman's social democrat, which is to say, while Sanders is a very passionate and engaging speaker who's very good at getting people riled up with his rhetoric, Elizabeth Warren is a kind of drier personality who prefers to talk about all of the clever ideas she's dreamed up to solve what she considers to be the fundamental problems of American capitalism. She's even made this whole meme for herself about how Elizabeth Warren is the woman with a plan for everything. Part of this comes from her old job as an Ivy League professor, where she spent a lot of time writing and thinking about issues relating to financial inequality and corporate power. But you know, overly academic politicians have their own problems as well. They can come off as too snobby or arrogant or hectoring. Warren and Sanders have two different approaches to win over a similar base of people, meaning that they are probably a greater threat to each other than Biden. And then rounding out the top four is unexpected rising star Pete Buttigieg. He is the mayor of a small town in Indiana called South Bend that I doubt most people have ever heard of. So how did he become such an overnight superstar? Well, a big part of it is just that his life story is very unique and compelling. Born in 1982, he was a Rhodes Scholar who left a high-paying job in the corporate sector to move back to his hometown and get involved in unglamorous local politics. Also, he is a veteran of the Afghanistan War. Also, he is gay. Buttigieg is a politician in the model of Barack Obama or Marco Rubio, in the sense that he is this young, fresh, charming guy who really exudes this aggressive wave of the future vibe. It is clear he wants to be seen as a new sort of politician from a new generation with lots of new ideas to solve all of America's new problems that the old politicians just don't know how to deal with. Of course, the question is whether he is more Obama than Rubio, which is to say, is he someone whose fresh appeal is strong enough to carry him all the way to the White House? Or is he just this kind of gimmicky character whose relevance is being inflated by a lot of undeserved media attention and slick marketing? If there is a common theme uniting these four, I would say it is that they all believe that they've got a real good strategy for reaching out to working class voters who have become a very sentimentalized segment of the American electorate in recent years. The idea is that Trump was only elected because he had some sort of powerful appeal to blue-collar white folk in important states like Michigan and Pennsylvania, and thus in order for the Democrats to win in 2020, they need to have some sort of strategy to pry these people away from him. Warren and Sanders thus portray their left-wing redistributionist economics as a way to materially help lower-class Americans, while Biden and Buttigieg more play up their cultural understanding of blue-collar America. Will any of this work? Who knows? All right, now let's go down the line and look at all of the other candidates. Below the big four, we could say there is the lesser three, and then the fringe 13, with the fringe 13 split into a famous and non-famous faction. Kamala Harris is an interesting case because it is not always clear if she deserves to be considered one of the major candidates or something a bit less. A lot of the polls say she is running basically equal to Buttigieg, but she also gets a lot less press than he does, which makes her seem less important. In any case, she is a senator from California, elected in 2016. She has an interesting background in that her mother is from India and her father is from Jamaica, which would obviously make her a historic first in a whole bunch of ways. Her political resume in California has been dominated by all of these law and justice jobs. She was a prosecutor for many years before serving as Attorney General, but this is also the root of some of her troubles. A lot of people would say that left-wing Americans do not really have as much respect for people who work in the law enforcement side of the criminal justice system anymore. Like a lot of the people that have held the sort of jobs that she has, Harris often defined herself as being, you know, sort of tough on crime. And a lot of Democrats would say that it is that sort of attitude that leads to all sorts of problems like police brutality and the over-incarceration of black men in prison. I'm not saying there's no other reason why Harris isn't doing better right now, but a sort of broad dislike of law enforcement is often offered up as the conventional explanation. Beto O'Rourke is next. He is an interesting guy because he became a national political celebrity mostly for losing an election. He is a former congressman who ran against Ted Cruz in last year's Senate election in Texas, and this made him very famous. Ted Cruz is considered one of the most right-wing members of the Senate and is fairly broadly disliked, I would even say, by other Republicans. And it's important to remember that Democrats have this whole big fantasy about one day being able to win elections in Texas and then control American politics forever, because at that point they would dominate all three of America's biggest states. But unfortunately for Beto, his star seems to have burned out rather quickly. Once he left the narrow context of Texas and entered national politics, it does not seem like people found him all that impressive anymore. This whole idea began to emerge that Beto was maybe a little too high on his own messiah complex, and that other than almost beating Ted Cruz, he wasn't a very accomplished politician. Cory Booker is a senator from New Jersey and the former mayor of his state's biggest city. He's not as famous as O'Rourke or Harris, but he was briefly a high-profile political celebrity as New Jersey's first black senator. I don't actually know a lot about Cory Booker, and I suspect that most Americans don't either. Because the candidate field is so crowded, the standards of just how famous you have to be to stand out are quite high. Merely being a somewhat well-known politician isn't really good enough. And on that note, now let us look at the next tier of candidates, the famous fringe. These are people who are kind of famous in theory, but their candidacies have been a real flop so far. Andrew Yang is a Silicon Valley businessman who has never held political office before, but he's been still getting a fair bit of attention as of late because of the way that he's very effectively marketed himself as the techie candidate. He's got a lot of very gimmicky plans for how America can win the future by embracing a bunch of paradigm-shifting new ideas. But the only one anyone seems to be particularly interested in is his idea to stimulate the economy by giving every American $1,000 a month. KIRSTEN GILLIBRAND is one of the senators from New York. She had a bit of a moment in the spotlight as a politician who really embraced the whole Me Too movement with a lot of gusto, but has now sort of faded from the scene. I've heard it said that a lot of the hype around her presidential ambitions was really just a byproduct of how New York-centric the American news media tends to be, which is why New York politicians, and frankly New Jersey politicians too, tend to get so much airtime. John Hickenlooper was the relatively popular governor of Colorado for a while. He was associated with his state's legalization of marijuana, but is increasingly forgotten today. Bill DeBLASIO is the current mayor of New York City, known for being quite aggressively left-wing in contrast to the two previous mayors of New York. He doesn't seem to be that popular in his own city these days, meaning that even the New York-centric media can't save him. Jay Inslee is the current governor of Washington State. He is very big into climate change and says he wants to run a single-issue campaign on that issue. But Washington may as well be on the moon for the amount of interest that the national media has in that state. Julian Castro is the former mayor of San Antonio, Texas, and served briefly in the cabinet of President Obama. He was another Texas Democrat who enjoyed a lot of hype for a time, but is now largely forgotten. The fact that he's the only Latino in the race doesn't seem to have helped him much. Tulsi Gabbard is a congresswoman from Hawaii. She is considered sort of like on the conspiratorial far left of her party, particularly as it relates to issues involving US foreign policy. If the field wasn't so crowded, you could imagine her standing out a bit more, but as it stands now, there is a lot of competition for the sort of harder left vote. Amy Klobuchar is a senator from Minnesota. I feel like she's considered one of the most conservative candidates in the race. She's supposed to be like the tough, no-nonsense Democrat who doesn't go in for all of this pie-in-the-sky liberal stuff. What people probably know her best for, however, if they know her for anything, is that she is supposedly a very cruel boss, prone to throwing binders at people. All right, and now for the Drek tier candidates. Tim Ryan is a backbench congressman from Ohio no one has heard of. Eric Swalwell is a congressman from California that no one has heard of. John Delaney is a former congressman from Maryland that no one has heard of. And Michael Bennet, meanwhile, is a senator no one has heard of. And lastly, there is Marianne Williamson, who is some sort of flaky self-help author. Her past books include The Age of Miracles, Embracing the New Midlife, and Tears to Triumph, The Spiritual Journey from Suffering to Enlightenment. Oprah is a big fan.
You have been a spiritual friend and counselor to me for years.
Marianne Williamson is by far the candidate that no one takes seriously at all in this race, meaning that if 2020 is anything like 2016, she will probably wind up as America's next president. So, if you are forced to choose, which Democrat do you like best, and why? It is perfectly okay, by the way, to just like a candidate because you kind of have a vague good feeling about them, or you just kind of broadly trust them because they've made some signal on some issue you sort of care about. I mean, at this point, where everything is still so early, and the field is still so crowded, and no one is yet making any real serious promises about anything, that's really all you have to go on. We will check back in a few months once the field has winnowed a bit. What's your prediction for that, by the way? Who would you guess are gonna make it to the final 2 or 3? Let me know, and I will see you all next week. Enjoy the debates.
Cash is hard to demonize.
True.
It's like if you say, hey, I'm gonna change your healthcare, be like, oh, death panels, doctors, like it's gonna screw it up. But it's like, hey, the Asian man wants to give you money. It's a little trickier to be like, oh, the money's gonna kill you.